Diane, can you see it?
Oh, yes.
I wasn't sure of the
I
angle.
would really be struggling if I couldn't see
Well, no,
that.
I just
Now,
wasn't sure if the angle.
see,
was-
before I got my eyes lasered, Martin, that might have been a challenge.
Okay.
I used to wear big glasses or lenses, one of the two.
We even know the time in Beijing.
Phil. No, it's good. It was nice to know.
to have a person.
Yeah, a person.
Because otherwise it
We just might find that we just then end up looking at you. Yeah, no, it's helpful.
All right, guys. So, you happy enough? Yeah.
Yep.
5, 4, 3.
So, good morning. It's great to be here with you to have this seminar about learning from our history, lament, forgiveness, and shalom. And this whole week in New Horizon has been about being a people of peace. But what does that mean for us here in Northern Ireland with our complicated history in our centenary year? In light of our troubles, what does that mean for us here? And so this seminar, we're going to be looking at really experiences of living in this place and the importance of subjects like lament, forgiveness, and shalom as we strive to be followers of Christ, not just pursuing an absence of conflict, but also what does true restoration and reconciliation mean with God and with each other? What does it mean to live in the shalom of God? So I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Father Martin McGill and Diane Holt and Reverend Tony Davidson. But before we get into the seminar, let me just pray. Heavenly Father, God of peace and shalom, thank you for the opportunity to take time to reflect together this morning on what it means to be truly reconciled to you and to each other. We recognise that as a society, we haven't often done this well. And so as we seek to learn from one another, we also ask for your forgiveness. We pray that you would guide our conversation and that your name might be glorified and your kingdom brought a little closer. In Jesus' name, amen. So, Martin, perhaps you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll move to Diane and Tony.
Okay. My name is Martin McGill. I'm parish priest in St John's Parish on the Falls Road, and I've been there for the last 4 years.
Thanks, Diane.
Hi. I am the director of Thrive Ireland, which really is an organisation that was birthed out of Tear Fund. So we are supporting churches to engage in their local community and also supporting leaders, really journeying with them, particularly those who live in areas of socioeconomic deprivation and also involved with peace and reconciliation. It really comes from the 15 years I spent in community and also working with Tear Fund in Africa. All the learnings come from there.
Brilliant. And Tony?
Hi, I'm the minister in First Armagh. I've been there for 27 and a half years. I've been involved in peace and reconciliation, I suppose, all my ministry through different stages, through the Troubles, peace process to now. A few years ago, I chaired the task group on dealing with the past, which produced this book, Considering Grace, written by Gladys Gagnon and Jimmy Johannes, and I now convene the Peace and Reconciliation panel.
Great, so loads of different experience in the room this morning. But Martin, maybe if I start with you and this idea of lament, and that's not a word that we talk about a lot, I don't think, as Christians, even though it's in the Bible a lot. And so in the context of our troubles and our country, what does that mean and why is that important for churches to be considering?
I was about to say, I don't think it's a word that we've talked about very much. I think it's a concept that we need to understand even better. I'm very grateful, especially over the last 6 months, or particularly over the last number of months, to have come across a Methodist minister originally from here, was ministering in Shankhill Methodist, and that's Dr. Mark Charles, who's presently in the States, and whose doctorate is actually in lament. And certainly some of the thoughts that I'm going to share with you in the course of this time together have been influenced by Mark. Lament, in many ways, is really the expression of our deepest feelings of loss, of anger, of pain, even at times hatred and bitterness. And I suppose when I've been thinking about it, a sense of that we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, and I want to come back to that in a moment or two. You quite rightly say it's very much in the scriptures, in the Hebrew Bible. 1/3 of the Psalms, of course, when we're thinking about lament, we will automatically think about the likes of the Psalms. And there's that sense of, as individuals, lament, complaint is brought to God and by whole communities. And that really is telling us something. It's telling us something that we haven't really brought into our whole experience of church, of faith, and expressing that in public life. But the whole idea of being able to bring ourselves completely as we are, our whole selves, our whole experiences before God, and even the parts of ourselves we prefer to hold back, they invite us to be honest. Can I share just a couple of verses from Psalm 69, just to give a sense of the depth of some of the feeling? Save me, O Lord, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold. And then it goes on. My eyes fail looking for my God. And that whole sense of the honesty of that, sometimes there's a sense in which we feel as if we have to almost present ourselves as if we've got our whole act together, and yet the Psalms give us the opportunity to be really honest about ourselves, to be able to express pain. That's very much part of it. Questions, doubt, anger, and even rage. But it doesn't stop there. And this is the really important thing, because we're people of faith, is that it goes the full circle and it comes back to a sense of being able to express great faith in God as we've actually worked through that whole process. Thinking about lament, I want to think about why we find it so difficult. I said I want to go back to the idea of vulnerability. It's my experience that for a lot of us as human beings, we don't do vulnerability well. That once we're into that sort of space, we become very defensive, and yet in lament we'll have the opportunity to be vulnerable before God, and we see that in the psalmist. I think part of the difficulty that we find with lament is the fact that in church we have certain ways to behave. We're for the most part very well mannered. I say for the most part, very well mannered. We're well behaved. We're very reserved. And yet there's a sense in understanding lament, it is not polite. It's just raw emotion at times. And one of the thoughts that I'm wondering about, wrestling with, is the whole idea of some sense of collective expression of pain, how that might sound. There was an interview on Sunday Sequence just before the service of lament way back in June, and the interviewer, Audrey Carville, asked the question, can you see it being a noisy affair? I think that's part of our difficulty, because we are so reserved. The God that we believe in is not afraid of questions, doubts, or strong feelings, but in fact, God encourages that. And so that whole sense of lament, I think, is really valuable, because I believe it can lead us towards release and healing. And so what could this look like for us as Christian people, our churches, and wider society? I very, very much welcome the opportunity. I had a moment's hesitation when I was asked to take part in this. I think this is really, really important. So I am going to make a suggestion. I am going to suggest that we look at a collective way in which we can lament together. And I think there's a stepping stone or a building block we can build on, and it goes back to the Day of Reflection, which each year is on the 21st of June. It's going back to 2007, and this year there was an experience of that, a collective experience of expressing lament on the 21st of June. In it was an hour-long service. There was a very poignant musical piece called Lament, and a very powerful film bringing out the whole idea of lament. And for me, part of it was the likes of Alan McBride, one of the victims' campaigners, taking part, expressing at the very start of it, lament. And then at the end of the lament, again, Alan expressing a sense of belief that this is the God who wipes away the tears from from all our eyes. And just to finish, Day of Reflection will actually talk about an opportunity to reflect on our own attitudes, on what more we might have done or might still do, and to make a personal commitment that such loss that we've had in our troubles here should never happen again.
Oh, that's brilliant. Martin, thank you. And just picking up on some of those things that you've talked about pain, doubt, anger and rage. Maybe pick up some of that with you, Tony, and this the whole idea of forgiveness. Very, it's a Christian belief, it's a Christian doctrine, and how that fits in with some of those feelings and with how we deal with the past and some of the difficulties around that as well.
Yep. I mean, what Martin said I found really helpful. I suppose one of the awful things that happened during the Troubles was after an atrocity, you'd have a victim, and somebody would stick a microphone in front of them and say to them, do you forgive the people who did it? And was re-victimizing the victims. And also was not really a biblical understanding of forgiveness. It was making forgiveness into a legalism, just a word, and superficial. And I think what Martin has said about lament, you have to get to forgiveness, you have to go through that process of lament. I mean, I've been a pastor a long time, and there's all sorts of things happen to people, and you can't get to that point of shalom immediately. And thankfully in the scriptures, God is patient with us, and he allows this process. So lament is absolutely essential. I was actually preaching on Psalm 108 on Sunday, and it gives us a whole language of cursing. You Moabite, you Edomite, you Philistine. And I think we pray when we feel good, but we actually should pray not only when we feel bad, but are bad. So I think forgiveness starts there, and a bit like Ecclesiastes, there's a time to forgive. And sometimes what happened, and we discovered this when we were interviewing 122 people for the book Considering Grace, an awful lot of people struggled with this concept of forgiveness. And a lot of people said they couldn't forgive. Now, Jamie Johannes, who did a lot of the interviews, felt that actually what they were able to do was to show mercy. And they were able to say, I don't want something to happen, even to the perpetrator, even if they have very negative feelings. And what they were trying to say was they knew that bitterness is toxic, and they didn't want to be bitter and to pass that on to the next generation. I can remember years ago visiting people who had been victims. I was at a job as an assistant minister in Ballycastle. The police had caravans there, and I remember talking to one lady, and she says, I am bitter against bitterness. I don't want to pass that on to my child, but I'm worried about the wider family that might be passed on. And she was trying to protect her child. Sometimes people can't get to the point where they see the person who did it, and they know that that would bring back toxicity, so they need distance and time to get to the point of forgiveness. I think, and Presbyterians are particularly, and I think evangelicals all, are very individualistic. We come to Christ as ourselves, and I think we tend to we think of an individual person who's the perpetrator. The problem with the conflict in Northern Ireland, and that Malcolm brought out certainly on Monday night, is that it's much more complex, and it's a community thing. And it's to try to get within our conversations across the community a sense of graciousness, that we're prepared to listen. When we were looking at Considering Grace and thinking back to the Troubles, we had to think about remembering. And we thought how you remember Christianly or non-Christianly. So you try to remember through the cross. And that means remembering truthfully, remembering therapeutically, and remembering together. So it's very important that I have conversations across the community with people so that we share their memories and try to work out how does that belong to the bigger story. And then, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, remembering the future as well.
Thanks, Tony. And I think, Dan, if we move on to you and thinking about this concept of shalom and what that means, because a lot of what Tony was talking about was about dealing with the past, but shalom's almost that remembering for the future, or building for the future. And you have experience of other places in the world who've also experienced conflict, and what lessons that we can learn from them. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, before I even do that, thank you, because I mean, we've been wrestling with these things. I remember a conversation previously with Martin about lament and how our communities desperately need to understand how to do it, because they're crying out for it. But I mean, I suppose people tend to think of shalom just as this sense of, it's about peace, when in fact it's actually a really dynamic word, and it's, as Tony was saying, how God intends things to be. It's the reconciling and the restoration of our relationships with God, with each other, and with all of creation. And, and I think at the heart of that is, it's the fact that relationships are a part of it. We used to joke when I worked in community and arts, it'd be great if it wasn't for the people, but that's, the reality is, relationships are the key. And, we are part of a people who are bringing people back into a state of harmony and well-being and helping to reconnect them. So the community part is really important, and maybe some of the issues, and having worked in Newton Ards in a very Protestant loyalist community, it's a very individualistic community, and our faith, is very individualistic. It lacks sometimes that community focus and engaging with each other. And the other thing that I'd say, and I mean, I will go on because it'll come out naturally in the conversation, but we're all called, Jesus was called Emmanuel, Prince of Peace. And it's a lifestyle. We're called to be, not to do. And therefore, everything about me and my attitudes with other people, no matter who they are, that's what enables us to journey alongside and be with people. And never mind the context of Northern Ireland, me as a white woman going out and working alongside people who are working in equally broken communities in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, I am the colonial white woman. How do I establish relationships of trust to enable and journey alongside and with people? And so the learning around that is huge, because we need to learn how to just engage with people because they're people, no matter who they are. And it takes a long time to build relationship. And therefore, it takes a long time to heal. So we need to model reconciliation in our own lives before, we can really help others. And that is, we tend to think about this idea of peace and reconciliation in the Northern Ireland community in some way, but actually it's about our families. It's about our churches. It's about our own small communities and streets. And we all know the broken relationships there. And actually, there's been some really interesting learning that I was working alongside an inspired individual from Tear Fund in Kenya, who was working in some very difficult slum areas. And those people were not ready to reach out into the community because they had really bad marriages, really paternalistic, treatment of women. They had relationships that were broken between brothers. And until they began to realize, actually, we need to work on those. They then discovered what reconciliation meant, and so they wanted to go out and enable other people to learn about it. And then going back to Tony, you were obviously reading my thoughts, because it's so complicated. It is so complicated. You really need to understand your specific context. You can't just go in there. It is complicated, and you need to look at the root causes. It's not just about the superficial stuff that you see, which is what we tend to be dealing with. It's a bit like that idea of, the consequences which are up in the leaves of a tree, if we think about it as a tree, the trunk being the problem in them. But what are the root causes that cause this? How do we find that? And listening, building those relationships and listening is so important. You can tell I'm a practitioner, can't you? But actually, I've also discovered, and again, we need to humble ourselves and pray, because prayer, if we don't do what we do with a prayerful heart and attitude, then how can we be successful? So, I mean, yes, I'm sure I'll be talking about Rwanda and some of the models they've used there and what we can bring as our learning, but those are the things that I'm sort of both taken from my African experiences, but also my Northern Ireland experiences.
Oh, that's really, really helpful, Diane. And I suppose maybe, Tony, to pick up something that Diane was talking about, kind of we're all called to do this in our own lives, and often this type of thing isn't readily seen as part of Christian discipleship. And just why do you think that is, and how do we start to turn that tide a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think within church circles, often people think of discipleship as something that I do. So that if I get this list of things and I do these, I then become a disciple. But the word means learning, and the word is about being. And it's about, I think, I often think that if you think of Northern Ireland, if you were somewhere else in the world, or a Martian looking down at us, and said, how are you getting on with discipleship? It's only people in Northern Ireland who wouldn't see this. Everybody from outside would say, well, what's the main problem in Northern Ireland? I mean, what's that word, two words associated with? It's associated with the fact that there are two groups who don't get on here. So I think in terms of our witness to the whole world, wouldn't it be great, as Malcolm said, that people look at Northern Ireland and they see something different. They see Shalom. But I think it goes back to this individualistic way of looking at things, and also a failure to look at the whole of the Bible, and a failure to look at those pictures from Isaiah about lions and lambs lying down together. That future can become our present.
And Martin, just to pick up something Diane said, just within your context, so New Horizon is a new experience for you, and you were delighted to come here and participate today. And Diane talked about understanding context, and you spend a lot of time trying to understand the context of other communities. And can you tell me a little bit what your heart is behind that and why that's important, and what are the sort of things that you do to listen and try and understand and to hear?
Well, I really want to go back to a word that Tony used a moment or two ago, which is the word witness. And I think I can now trace it back. I think I can trace my interest in this back to an experience I had. Part of my training was in Rome. I went to the Irish College for 4 years there, went to two universities, one for 3 years and then one for a final year for a master's. And there was one particular evening returning back from college, bumped into a group of American students, and we got chatting, and one of the questions they asked was, where are you from? So I said, and this is way back around about maybe say 1986, 87, Belfast. Without a moment's hesitation, I can't remember was a male or female American student replied, oh yes, that's that place where Catholic and Protestant kill each other. I've never forgotten that conversation. And that's why I think the whole idea of witness is so important. So I'm very much with Malcolm Duncan in the sense of people looking at Northern Ireland and seeing something very different, and yeah, very keen to explore the concept of what Shalom would actually look like. So that sense of, yeah, trying to understand, trying to listen. For me, I suppose one of the ways I would do that would be, or at least pre-COVID anyway, was on a Sunday evening, I would worship in a denomination other than my own. I was doing this really for a number of years and found it really, really helpful. I was in Windsor Baptist before it became this amazing place. Very positive experience there as well. And that was just really useful to just get some idea of how different people worship. But there was also, and again, to go back to something Diane said, there was the building of relationships. And, you know, whilst we're going to talk about all these words, lament and forgiveness and shalom, I think at the end of the day, we are about talking about, if necessary, healing of relationships or forming of relationships, and in that context, looking at how we can be witnesses to being followers, disciples of Jesus.
So I think like one of the things that's coming through is that this is not a quick fix. This is long-term work. This is starting something and maybe not seeing the fruit that you might not see in your own lifetime, but that you are persistent and consistent in this part of discipleship. Diane, do you want to talk a little bit? You've mentioned some other countries there. Maybe talk about the experience from Rwanda or some of those other places that you have knowledge of and have invited people from there over here to kind of speak into our situation as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that sense of, you know, the complicated nature of seeking to achieve shalom. You know, we heard about mercy, but actually we hear in the Bible as well, in the passage actually in Isaiah where we're told about, you know, Jesus is coming, you know, but he's a God of justice. It's not just, you know, so there's justice, there's mercy, there's peace. It's all there. And actually, I think I've become much, much more aware of how important that is. So Zimbabwe was a really interesting example of, you know, we the churches there are really struggling around not just conflict issues, but hugely bad governance, and are really mobilizing the churches to speak out against injustice, to speak out against things that aren't right, and to really understand that they are drawing alongside the poor. Now, there's no doubt in my mind, having worked in, East Belfast, in Newtonards, poverty and brokenness go hand in hand. And actually, there's a lot of scapegoating goes on around, particularly, and of course my experience is from Protestantism, but, loyalist estates and those who are less well off, and everything, and it's like a hidden brokenness there, because if I think of one estate in Newtonards, and, people actually throw the rubbish over the wall into that estate from a much nicer development on the other side. Everything that is stating that's an issue. And you see the same thing when you're in Africa. So a community in the Democratic Republic of Congo, very poor, very corrupt society. But, the women, there was a military camp there where the women, basically the community around that military camp, were incredibly suspicious, didn't like them, didn't know anything about them. They were totally segregated. One of the leaders that I was working alongside, he and his wife in fact started to bring the women together, what we would call initially single identity work and then some mediation to build relationships. And when I met the women were going, and we thought these women were dirty, and we thought they were really stupid, and yet look, we're just the same, and we have the same, and they're actually really good, and they'd come into a cooperative. So they were jointly working together. Not only was peace being built, but actually they were economically developing some work, together. So they formed a cooperative, breeding chickens and then selling them. So we need to think much more, I think, in terms of learning about how do we not think about peace in a much more holistic way, and not, at the moment, our funding, for example, is community development here, a big silo, and here's peace and reconciliation here. We need to be thinking much more integrated, because it is total, our lives are not segregated. So why would why would peace and reconciliation and community development, or what I like to think of as, human developing or human thriving within communities, why would they be separate? Because we can't not do peace and reconciliation here at the same time.
And Tony, maybe we pick up with you some of those things that Dan's talking about. Do you think that impacts the younger generation of people in Northern Ireland, of Christians in Northern Ireland? How might younger people be encouraged to kind of engage in some of these conversations, do you think?
Yes, I know Martin has thought a bit about this, with how young people who don't remember the Troubles, how are they impacted? Unfortunately, a lot of the studies are that if your parents were traumatized during the Troubles, you are traumatized, and often worse. I mean, a lot of the studies on mental health in Northern Ireland date back to the Troubles, so there's a lot of healing, and the healing isn't just, it's a healing within, and peace within is needed, as well as peace with others. So for a lot of young people, they go, what's wrong? Somebody said to me, there's a crack in our wall, and I don't know why it was there, and discovered it was a bomb that went off. And sometimes there's cracks around our relationships, and there's cracks within our minds that explains. So I think for young people, that's important. But I think, and this is a quotation from this book Sue Diven wrote, Guard Your Heart. Sue grew up in our church in First Armagh. And it's about two young people who were born the day of the Good Friday Agreement, so they have no memory of the Troubles. And it's Romeo and Juliet. They're from both sides of the community. But there's this lovely quotation in it where one of them says, adults remember our past. Would they ever remember our future? So how are we going to live in this place well? And how are we going to prosper together? And how are we going to love our neighbour together? Those are vital questions for young people.
Martin, do you have anything, you would be involved in the Four Corners Festival and engaging with young people in that through different activities there. Any sort of reflections on that?
Well, I suppose one of the things that I would go back to. I'm very pleased that we're taking a look at some of the root causes, for example. And when you talk about Four Corners Festival, we organised an event a number of years ago where we had prayer at the different walls. So, for example, some of us gathered at walls. This was one of the final events. But when it actually came to a part of the city, in fact, South Belfast, we then focused on the socio-economic divisions and that whole sense of those who are very well off and those who are not. I suppose my sense would be young people would be very much aware of that. And yeah, I would certainly agree with Tony in the sense of, and I've heard that whole sense of the trauma being passed down, the stories being passed down. On a Saturday evening, I would go out with, not every Saturday evening, but when I can, sometimes by myself, sometimes with a Church of Ireland minister, Reverend Tracy McRoberts, who's in the St Matthew's Church of Ireland over at Woodvale on the Shankle Road. And we actually hear some of the stories. We can actually hear some of the young people almost, when they're sort of talking things through, just almost talk through some of that sort of trauma. So there is a sense in which I think we do need to look at some of the deeper causes or the root causes, but that we do it together. And I mean, if I just, for example, mention Shankle Falls, there's a real sense in which, the two areas develop almost by themselves. I suppose with Tracy and I, we're looking at, is there some way of being able to work together so we actually could look at the common good, a flourishing, a thriving together?
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, just following on from both Father Martin and Tony, in Rwanda, there is exactly the same issue. So we've got children, because they're the genocide, well, as I have now learned, this was one of many genocides, but the 1994 genocide was now, 26 years ago. And of course, there are lots of children who've grown up. And with the current Rwandan government is very much, they have 100 days of remembrance every year, which starts, and that's basically how long the genocide lasted in 1994. So from the 7th of April into the 4th of July, and it's an opportunity. So it's like a top-down thing, but it's also a bottom-up thing within the community where people remember. But the message is very much, we are neither Hutu nor Tutsi, we are Rwandan. That's the message that's put out. But actually, in reality, people are still Hutu and Tutsi. And in your house, the children are then with their parents learning and finding out a little bit more. But people often, they lost huge swathes of their family. I mean, it's just absolutely horrendous. But actually, a lot of the perpetrators and victims together who've been working with one of my leaders in Rwanda are going into schools now to jointly tell their stories. And children are queuing up because they want to know what went on, because they don't either, they're not, it's too painful, or they're getting it in other ways from different behaviours, which, are because of brokenness and hurt. So I do think there's something, and we're in Thrive Ireland, we're working alongside SEF at the moment, and we've been trying for 2 years to get out for them, victims, survivors from the Troubles here, to go out and meet with victim survivors of the genocide in Rwanda and just look at some of the learning in those groups. Because they say, look, victims and perpetrators have come together, because often people were released from prison in Rwanda and were going back to their villages and then re-traumatizing, exactly what you're saying, re-traumatizing their victims. But the churches actually have taken a lead in this, and it's the churches that are helping facilitate the long workshops which enable some journey, and it's a long journey towards forgiveness and, if it's possible, reconciliation. And one of the things that really struck me when Christophe, who's the leader I would work alongside and one of our partners in Rwanda, really struck me for the first time, and it's so simple, but forgiveness is, as Tony said, about you really, and it's really toxic if you cannot enable yourself, and that there's no sense that God's going to help you towards that forgiveness, because you've got all this baggage and it's burdening you. But actually, reconciliation needs the other person. And what happens if that other person is dead, or that other person doesn't care, or that other person has moved to another country? Where does that leave you? And so the journey with these people is, yes, with those perpetrators who are willing to be on that journey, but I think also then to help others to understand that journey. And the other thing, again, I was talking about before, it's not just that they come together, but there's an economic development side of that as well in this Cow for Peace. It's called Cow for Peace. So the family of the victim, you know, is really given a cow to look after, and the first calf is given by the victim to the perpetrator's family, and both families together look after the cow and build relationships over the long term through that very important functional helping me thrive and develop in my own economic existence.
So you talked a little bit there as well, Diane, about storytelling, and in a sense, Tony, considering Grace was and is a storytelling project, but it's more. Can you just share a little bit, I guess, about what the value of that has been, or what we've even seen growing out of that now that the book's kind of out there?
Yeah, one of the beauties of people tell a story, and it's very much in story form, is that the story creates a wee bit of space. And what we found very powerful, even in liturgy, is to read one of those stories and to feel the pain. And actually, just before lockdown at Four Corners Festival, Martin very graciously invited us up to the Falls Road, and I read a story there about a RIR man who'd been killed in County Armagh on the Falls Road, which was an extraordinary thing. And to hear people empathising into that situation. It was also just after the death of Seamus Mallon, who wasn't able to come, and I had taken part in his funeral service, and to share some of the stuff around Seamus as well. So I think we've actually produced some material on this that can be used in local congregations, and not just for Presbyterians. And it gets, when you hear one story, you go, oh, my story's a bit like that. So you start to share your story. And we found not only did we share the stories in this, we asked people to take a little bit of time and to share their story. And to get that out, the story becomes a lament, Martin, as well, to some extent. The thing then that is really challenging is to do that together, because this is about Presbyterians and their experience of the Troubles. I need to hear stories from the other community, and that's a discipline that we have to continue, and as a challenge for the future.
And Martin, just thinking about that, so acknowledging that, for example, you and Tony coming as clergy, but with different understandings of theology, but how important is it to try and find some common ground on this issue, and why is it important for churches in the public square to be talking about this?
So in terms of as an issue, to be able to, when you go back to the remembering together, absolutely key. I'm just very conscious. These last few days have been quite difficult. They've been very painful to watch in social media from Sunday. The Deputy First Minister tweeted about Tom McElwee, who was one of the hunger strikers, died after 62 days. This was the 40th anniversary of his death on Sunday. And she finished it with words in Irish, Fuair sé bás, our son Saoirse na hÉireann, which translates, he died for the freedom of Ireland. But there was no reference whatsoever to the wider context. So the likes of, he had been involved along with some colleagues in planting bombs in Ballymena, fire bombs in Ballymena, one of which killed a 26-year-old woman called Yvonne Dunlop, the mother of 3 children, in her own shop. And then just watching that reaction, so it's very, very clear for us at this time, this is a hugely important issue. And that whole sense of remembering together, how do we do that? So the likes of, for Tom's family, obviously a very significant day for them. But there's the wider context, and we keep bumping up against that. I know, for example, say the likes of the Shankill bombing, but we could take so many different examples of remembering. And remembering for us is a really difficult word. But how do we do that together, I think, is quite significant. And the likes of churches, I happen to believe churches have a valuable role in this, and there's the key word, sanctuary. And again, if I could go back to an experience that we've had in Four Corners Festival, and we found in the very early stages, we put on events. We then had a Q&A, a question and answer session. And before we knew it, people were telling their stories. So we realized we had to respond to that in some way. So the likes of a church, and you mentioned the likes of the parish hall there, Tony, it was a very powerful evening. I hadn't read the book at that stage. I've now read the book. It's a very, very powerful read. And I would suggest there's a paradigm, there's a model there for some of the other denominations to work with. And I suppose one of the challenges I would love to throw out to churches generally is we have a lot of really good resources out there. And hopefully, please God, I know there was prayer beforehand, you prayed as well at the very start of this, Karen. Please God, this could be a resource as well. But it only can really be a valuable resource if we decide we're actually going to take this and do something with it. So the likes of the work that's been done, how do we build on that rather than reinventing the wheel time after time after time?
And Diane, again, just from your understanding and knowledge from different parts of the world, that role that churches have speaking into society on issues like this, why, from your perspective, is that important?
Yeah, I mean, in Rwanda, again, the storytelling is hugely important. You know, maybe we know it by testimony here. Maybe it's a language thing that we need to think of, but actually I think storytelling is probably more helpful in some ways. I remember when I was in Rwanda for the very first time, and we like lemons, all the white people were sitting at the front in white plastic chairs of this church full of victim survivors, feeling so inadequate. But also the fact that one woman stood up and she had walked quite a way to be there, and it transpired actually, because our translator worked for Tear Fund, that she'd never told her story before, but she wanted to. And we were there to hear it, and it was awful. But for her, it was really important to tell. And, you know, we facilitated recently a series of webinars called Encounter, Thrive Ireland, again in partnership with SEF. And I do think the church has a role, Martin, to enable particularly victim survivors, because it seems to me that they're almost having to advocate for themselves half the time. And we need to be there to listen, to understand, and to, you know, help them in this difficult and unjust circumstance. Especially with the Secretary of State's announcement not that long ago. I mean, I just think that, you know, they have all been scapegoated because of so-called peace. And actually there's a gap in terms of how they've been enabled and facilitated. And, you know, I would like to see the churches understanding more, because it was interesting, some of the things are not on purpose. You know, some of the things that happen aren't on purpose. Maybe a minister in the Presbyterian context, for example, moves on to another church, or it happens in another context, and then they don't know the story or the history of a victim survivor within that congregation, and then that can be extremely painful. So, you know, I think we need to understand, it's almost like we try to sanitize ourselves against it, because it is painful, but it is part of all of our stories. And, you know, if I even think, and I was someone who grew up, you know, born in 1964, moved out of Belfast in 1969, and so was relatively untouched, except that I saw the television every day, except that, you know, I remember walking into university in Wales for the first time into a shop and lifting my arms up and then being very embarrassed that nobody was going to search me. So there's something not normal about that. But having said that, you know, we have still got the ability to pass stuff on to our children. So I think all of this is not separate, but holistic. And this idea of shalom really encompasses all of that. And
at the risk of leading us into a whole other conversation, maybe briefly, Tony, Diane mentioned, referred to the announcement from the Secretary of State back in July about plans for what I've described as a statute of limitations, and almost drawn a line for them under the past. And yeah, just wondered, do you have any brief reflections on that before we wind things up?
Yeah, I think Psalm 85 talks about how peace and truth and mercy and justice all embrace. And if you have one without the other, they start to slip. And so when you're trying to think of how we're going to deal with the past, in a sense, just to forget is not going to particularly work. Now, how you work all that out is very, very difficult. But it has to be a process to go back together. And I think that's the problem with the present process, is that one particular party, the United Kingdom, has gone off and said, this is what we're going to do. Whereas this was part of a process that involved the Republic, involved all the political parties. So that's why obviously the other political parties aren't happy with that, and quite rightly so. There does have to be mercy, but it has to be balanced with the justice, and maybe this is a way of getting to the truth. So yeah, it's going to be a difficult process.
Thanks very much. And I think we're probably coming towards the end of our time. I think we could probably talk for another hour or so about all of those things. But so it's just as we finish and reflecting on our conversation around lament, forgiveness, shalom, and being a people of peace, I wanted to ask each of you if you have a sentence or a word or a phrase that you would just like to finish with, or I don't know, just as a summing up or as a challenge or a reflection. Martin, if I come to you first.
Yeah, mine's going to be a challenge. So to those of you who are watching this, and please God, you've found something that really has stood out for you. Maybe it's a word, maybe it's a phrase, maybe it's an idea we've talked about. So I just want to leave you with a question and a challenge is, well, what are you going to do about it?
Great. Tony?
Yeah, to perhaps continue, Martin, who are you going to talk to? Can you have a conversation across the divide? Can you give this book to somebody across the divide and say, could you read it and we'll have coffee in a couple of weeks' time? Would you like to give me a book and I'll read it? Where can you go with this? Who are you going to talk to? And are you going to move beyond your comfort zone a wee bit?
Diane?
Yeah, and who is your divide? Where is your divide? Because actually, I've worked in context in Newton Ards where people didn't have any issue reaching out their hand to their nice middle-class Catholic neighbour if they were Protestants, but they really struggled with those who were in the Loyalist estates surrounding. So, I think, but what I have found is that, yes, initially there is discomfort, but the discomfort leads to something that is joyful in the end. And actually, when you come through that, there's something spiritually important about that. You can feel God blessing it, and we mustn't ever take the fact that this is what the Bible's telling us. This is what God is saying is vital. He sent Jesus as the Prince of Peace, the wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, and we are his people, and therefore we are the instruments that he wants to use. So I take those challenges totally. So how is he going to use you?
Brilliant.
Is my challenge.
Thank you. Tony, Diane, Martin, thanks very much just for your thought-provoking input into the seminar. So, and the challenge really for us all to be people of peace. So thank you.